Good afternoon, distinguished guests. I'm Ling Da-he, and I will be your MC today. Thank you all for joining us today here at the 2022 Masters Forum in Sinology. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the Tang Prize Foundation has organized a series of online forums. These forums provide the public with the rare chance to converse with the laureates. Today, we are immensely honored to have the world's leading experts in the field of Sinology with us. Professor Jessica Rawson, the 2022 Tang Prize laureate in Sinology, will join us remotely later from the UK. We would like to first invite the Dean of College of Liberal Arts, Professor Huang Muxuan, to give us the opening remarks. Let's welcome Professor Huang.
Good afternoon, everybody. Professor Tang, Jessica Rawson, Professor Chen Zhenchuan from Tang Prize Foundation, and Professor Wang Dewei from Harvard University, and Professor Li Yongdi from Chicago University, and Professor Chen Fangmei and Professor Shi Jingfei from our Graduate Institute of Art History, National Taiwan University. Dear guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 2022 Tang Prize Master Forum in Sinology. I have to thank you, the Tang Prize Foundation and the Graduate Institute of Art History. Their contribution make this event possible. I'm also grateful to the Institute of Applied Mechanism for this beautiful conference hall. As we know, the Tang Prize in Sinology has great history. It recognizes the study of sinology, the broadest sense, and the honor innovation in the long-standing research field since 2014. We have had great researchers like Professor Yu Yingshi, William Theodore de Bary, Shiba Yoshinobu, Stephen Owen, and Wang Gengwu be the awards laureates. And I believe our understanding in this field has deepened and become more comprehensive after Professor Rawson received the prize this year. Most of you already familiar with Professor Rawson and her achievement in the field of Chinese art and archaeology. And it is no need for me to introduce you to all of her various contributions. Professor Rawson shows that besides the written word, there is the language of objects. By reading the art and the artifact of the world, we can interpret and understand distant and ancient societies, which their beliefs and interactions. Professor Rawson teaches us a new way to see the world. As far as I know, this is not the first time we have been honored to be Professor Rawson's audience at the National Taiwan University. In 2009, the Graduate Institute of Art History invited Professor Rawson for a lecture. From Rome to China, the role of ornament in trade, exchange, and colonization. Today, I feel grateful to be part of this reunion of academic friendship. I'm looking forward to enjoy and learning from today's conference. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Huang. Please take a seat. Next, we would like to invite all guests and participants to take a group photo. Our photographer will take the group photo from the stage, so you may remain in your seats. During this forum, audience members will have the opportunity to ask questions. As this is a hybrid event, we will be taking questions using this online platform. To submit your questions, please scan the QR code on the screen or click on the Slido link below the live stream channel. Next, let's welcome the moderator of the forum, Professor David Dewey Wang, Edward C. Henderson Professor of Chinese Literature at Harvard University, to introduce the 2022 Tang Prize laureate in Sinology, Professor Jessica Rawson. Welcome, Professor Wang.
Thank you. Professor Dame Jessica Rawson, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. This is a great opportunity, truly a genuine pleasure for me to introduce the 2022 Tang Prize laureate in Sinology, Professor Jessica Rawson of Oxford University. Professor Rawson has dedicated herself to learning, teaching, and studying the world of ancient objects in China and other Eurasian and European civilizations. Over the years, she has trained many generations of students to learn the beauty of the muted world of objects, to give these objects voices of their own, and to let all of us see when things we are looking at. So this is truly a tremendously challenging and exciting field, and we appreciate the dedication Professor Rawson has made not only to Chinese civilization and also to other civilizations related to China. I think some of you here are quite familiar with the merits, the numerous merits of Professor Rawson, which probably don't need much introduction. But here, I just enumerate a few factors to show how she has contributed herself to the world of Chinese sinology, particularly in the field of art and archaeology. Professor Rawson currently is a professor of art and archaeology at University of Oxford. She also has served as the first female warden of Morton College at Oxford, and she was also elected to be the first pro-vice-chancellor at Oxford. And in those capacities, she has demonstrated a female scholar's talent, professionalism, and expertise, not only at the administrative level, but also particularly at the scholarly exchange, not only among students at Oxford, but also among students all over the world. And before then, Professor Rawson was also the keeper of Oriental antiques at the British Museum, and at that position, she has served a long time for as many as 28 years. Definitely a fact, again, deserving our genuine and profound respect. Among the numerous honors and recognitions Professor Rawson has received from worldwide, I would like particularly mention the fact that she was made Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire, and she's also a Fellow of the British Academy of Science and Arts, and also she was and is the Fellow, Honorary Fellow of the American Academy of Science and Arts. And also she received in 2017 the very, very distinguished prize of Freer Lang Medal, which represented the highest honor in world art history and archaeological studies. Definitely, Professor Rawson has never ceased at any moment her energy and engagement with the work of archaeological excavation and artistic engagement. of the numerous publications that she has presented not only to us, but all over the world. And I just wanted to point out the fact that Professor Rawson is particularly engaged in the world of ancient China, which for her is not just a singular and a very, isolated or engaged world of its own. It is a world with numerous civilizations in dialogue and in contestation. So this is the world of China that she has tried to explore and introduce to the whole world. In the meantime, she also was able to bring this world of China to bear upon the whole world. That's the world beyond China. So particularly, I wanted to salute Professor Rawson for her cosmopolitan undertaking, trying to show us how big, how comprehensive, and how complex world civilizations could really be, of which China was a very, very active part. So through her study of objects, jades, bronzes, golds, all metal objects, through tomb excavations, through all these kind of object studies, she was able to bring into view that splendor and the variety and the vitality of such a world. And particularly in recent years, she has turned her attention to the study of horses, the horses, how this particular animal was being used as not only a vehicle for transportation, but also a vehicle for cultural communication between Asia and Europe, and among Eurasian cultures, civilizations, and of course, within Chinese civilizations. So this is a truly daunting task that really breaks the grounds for our study of a Silk Road civilization and other civilizations before the opening up of the Silk Road. And she was able to bring us to recognize the extremely active and interactive world in ancient times between China and beyond. And for today, and she particularly wants to introduce a topic that is derived from her most recent book, a book which will be published in 2023, next year. And the topic for today is bronze, jade, and gold, the language of objects and their contexts. I think most of us here are interested in the humanities at large, or Chinese humanities in particular. We tend to talk about language in terms of textual terms. We tend to talk about the stories of words, or story made up of words. And through language, we come to realize and order the whole system of our knowledge. Instead, Professor Rawson would rather argue that beyond the language of words, there are the language of objects. Beyond the stories of a text and the words, there are stories of objects. These objects, although seemingly looking mute or muted, they are actually all agents which were able to transmit all sorts of messages. So through these objects, we actually can understand and discovered and even formulate a narrative of narratives. And that is the kind of meta-narrative which illuminate the vitality of ancient Chinese civilizations. And today, Professor Rawson is only to guide us to one aspect of her discovery, and certainly we are all looking forward to the publication of her new book, which will be coming out next year. And the title of the book is Life and Afterlife in Ancient China. So let me just take this opportunity to express my personal respect to Professor Rawson for her dedication to the field of Chinese archaeology for decades, and for her engagement to really educate and spread all the information she has discovered all over the world, not only to professionals, but also to some audiences and some of us who care about about civilizational histories, but are eager to learn a little bit more through Professor Rawson's books and introductions. So this is a truly precious opportunity for us to be getting together to express our appreciation of Professor Rawson's scholarship. And particularly, we are all eager to learn something from Professor Rawson today, and hopefully eventually through her presentations in her books and the narratives. So I wanted to again thank the Tang Prize for giving me this opportunity to chair the selection committee of the prize committee in Sinology, and truly to me, this is the greatest moment for me to introduce the laureate of this year, Professor Jessica Rawson. Now, without further ado, may I have the honor to introduce Professor Rawson, starting her lecture today. Thank you very much. Thank you.
It is a tremendous honor, an enormous privilege to have received the Tang Prize in Sinology, and I'm exceptionally grateful to all of you for this special opportunity to present one aspect of my work and my research for which the prize is offered. I wish to thank first of all and profoundly the founder of the Tang Prize and everybody involved with the prize and its award to me. I'm just touched by the dedication that the founder and the whole of the office of the foundation have shown to the history of China and its importance in the world. And I want also to thank all of you gathered here today to take part in this forum. I'm especially grateful to Professor Wang for agreeing to take the task on of the moderator. He has expressed very clearly many of the aims that I've had in my work, and I'm extremely grateful for this opportunity to explain it in more detail, but only to concentrate on one part. I want also to thank the three panelists who I know very well, Professor Chen Fangmei, Professor Shi Jingfei, and Professor Li Yongdi. It is simply a great regret that I cannot be with you all in the same room and talk about these ideas and get your reactions, not just for a short time, but over a longer period. I start here in what is, in a way, one of my homes, the ancient library of my college, Merton, which was built in the 14th and 15th century at Merton College, then a very early institution of the study of religion, of medicine, and of law. It is my college in Oxford to which I came in 1994. I have suggested that we can look at objects as we would look at books, that we can read those books and we can read the objects. And the language is as available to us as English or Chinese is, which we then read in these books. But of course, we need to think what I mean by language. Like all verbal languages, our visual language is complex and has many facets. To begin with, I start with a painting, a European painting, which is very symbolic. If we look at these objects as symbols, we can see at once that they have meaning in the Christian church. This is a painting of the 16th century in the Netherlands by Jos van Cleve. It's not an important painting, it just happens to illustrate for me very clearly the points I wish to make. His finger, Saint Jerome, the translator of the Bible into Latin, is pointing at a skull, the source of spiritual perfection. And on the table, much more mundane, are his spectacles, a symbol of understanding. These objects are actually joined to a culture and can only be understood in that culture. The candle on its candlestick is a sign of spiritual illumination. And in our language of English, but not so much in Chinese, light is a sign of intellectual and spiritual endeavor and achievement. This is the book under his elbow, which he translated. And then here we have it in a detail, the spectacles, the candle. And now these three the kettle, the platter, and the towel are preparations for ritual. So the painting is using objects to talk to us. Actually, I've missed out the bird. The bird is in the cage. The bird can fly to the heavens. It's like the spirit enclosed in the mortal frame, a very Christian idea. So you have to belong to this culture to interpret it, but the painter and his audience are very willing to use objects as a language, in this case, one with almost a given vocabulary. You too in China have a language attached to objects, but more to images, if you like. Here is the bat, and the bat is on a gourd, and the gourd is tied with a ribbon. So these three have very distinctive meanings. The bat is the same as Fu, of blessings. The long ribbon is Shodai, representing longevity. And the vase, shaped like a gourd, represents fertility, many sons, and it is also thought to absorb evil vapors. Now, when I've written about the ornament of China in the past, I've always been amazed and astounded by how it continues today, that you may find images of bats upside down, Fu Daola, so that the importance of images as symbols, objects, motifs, shapes, is very well established in both our cultures. But now I want to go a whole step further and to look at everyday life, because actually that's where we live. And so my third example, before we get to ancient China, is the kitchen. And here you have three kitchens that I have chosen, partly with the help of Linda Chu. So we have a Western kitchen. This is a 19th century Western kitchen modeled for display in a museum. And we have the standard objects, the saucepans in which we boil our food. We don't cook it nearly as efficiently as you do. We put vegetables in boiling water and all the goodness boils away. We have knives and spoons. We have lots of platters, plates on which to put things. And here we also have a stove. The stove is usually fired from below. This is a standard modern kitchen in China, in Taiwan, sent to me by you, Linda, very courteously. And here we have a wok, different frying pans, a very large chopper compared with the smaller knives that we have in the West, and a bamboo bowl, covered basin with chopsticks. So we never see chopsticks in a Western kitchen of the 19th century. This is a more recent, if you like, assemblage for a museum, a dim sum kitchen, it's said, and here you have bowls, so that the bowl is much more important in China than it is in the West, where we have platters. I hope, by the way, you can see my cursor. I have no idea if you can. So what I would perhaps remind you of is that I cannot cook in a Chinese kitchen. I wouldn't know how to make the foods with which I'm familiar. And certainly I couldn't cook here. So that a whole series of names of the objects, of the foods with which they're associated, but also the physical movement of my hand and my body and my arm are tied up in my kitchen as yours is tied up in your kitchen. I've just chosen the kitchens by chance because it is clear that when cooking, we use an assemblage of objects. We need cooking pans, we need jugs, we need storage items, and then we need serving platters or serving bowls. So that there is a whole complex, and probably what part of my interest in the language of objects has shown is that to understand a society, it is better to look at whole assemblages than single objects. So if we turn to a single object, the buffalo here in bronze, which I presented in a book edited by Professor Lai, and I'm very pleased to have done so, I want to show perhaps the top object in a particular assemblage. But it's very hard to make any sense of it if you just see it by itself. It is quite dramatic. It's a large image or model of an animal, a buffalo, with a horrific tiger on its body. There are also tigers and birds on its jaws, and the tiger has sharp teeth. So what is its meaning? Well, we honestly don't know. And we need to recognize that we don't know. I think that is one of the important things that has led me to think about how we could start to decipher the ancient world by looking at groups of objects. So, in fact, I've chosen the group of objects from 3 tombs, because tombs are like kitchens. They're whole assemblages presented together to show the life of an individual as interpreted by the ritual specialists of the day and probably his closest family. So it is a choice deliberately made to show that person, but it's chosen perhaps not by the individual, but by the ritual group around him or her or his own family. We're now going to move to this geography with which I have been obsessed for a long time. And I point out that China, the main central part of China, the lowland, is next to a large area of Loess, the Loess Plateau, which is, in my language, called the Arc, but Tung and Zheng called it the Banyue Di Dai. So that this area of difference from the lowland has been known for a long time and is the bridge between central China and the steppe. This, I'm not going to speak at length about the horses, but the horses come from the steppe through the Arc to the center of China. But in fact, the horses come into my first example. The Loess Plateau is unbelievably important to China, and it is not an area that is much visited. This is what it looks like on a good sunny day. It's piles and piles of very fine dust blown from the Altai Mountains, the Gobi Desert, and all the mountains and deserts in between over northern China, and forms deposits between 200 meters deep down to 2 or 3 meters deep. And because of that Loess, we have many facets which I cannot elaborate, but it's responsible in part for very good bronze casting and for very deep tombs. And the Loess extends the silt to Anyang, which you all know is the capital of the late Shang. And so one of my topics today is one of the tombs where this buffalo comes from at Anyang. So this is the boundary as the current archaeologists set it out. These are the royal tombs here north of the river Huan. And we have 2 more tombs. At Xiaotun is Fu Hao, the consort of the king, and Hua Yuanzhuang, the site of this tomb that I'm so interested in. This tomb here at the center is a man buried with his face downwards. That is extremely unusual. Burials normally in Shang China are supine, that is, the face of the person is facing upwards and his body is extended, or her body is extended. In this case, that is not so. The man is buried face downwards, and I have traced with colleagues in a paper that this is typical of northern China, beyond the Loess Plateau in Inner Mongolia and further north into the steppe. There are people who argue that this individual is nothing to do with the north and is a prince of the late Shang or even a southerner. I'm not going to respond to that, and I don't think it's a very helpful interpretation. He may have had southern contacts, but his objects, his possessions show he's a fighter. He has many, as you see here, many weapons, and he has, very importantly, these sets of ritual vessels. His burial here, not far from Fu Hao, and with large sets of ritual vessels, and with many accompanying servants or supporters, these are not sacrifices, these are his supporters, is a sign that he's very highly regarded. So the choice of calling him a prince is not surprising. It's just that there are some oddities about this. First of all, you can see his vessels. And I'm not going to go into all the detail, but they're a bit surprising. He has a large ding and many others. He has 8, but he also has rather few gui vessels. He has 1 yen, and then he has 2 very fine wine vessels. And these are square sectioned, showing that they're very high status and somewhat different from the ceramic versions. And he also has sets of gu and jiu, which are very important, but they're in this case a little odd in that they do not, there's a set of 4 and a set of 5, making up 9, which may be a significant number, but they don't belong together. They're 2 different sets. And this is where I want to make another point. Here is the enumeration of the vessels in his tomb. And what we see, and we must just notice, is there are no water vessels. So the set isn't complete. Was it put together in a hurry? I rather think so, because the vessels are not all inscribed, but some are. And these 2, the Fangjia and the Fangcun, are singletons. They should be there in pairs, but they're not. And this Zun has 2 inscriptions in the lip. This is on the inside, in fact. They should really be here in foot. And that is all a bit surprising. I also think it's useful at this moment to point out that within the objects group, and the objects are an important ritual canon group, and they are important as a statement, they are an object statement of the status of this man, you also have to take into account there are many different examples of the Taotie on these bronzes. And I would call these a visual system. They are a way of decorating these bronzes, perhaps with meaning, but they can be manipulated. As in many other parts of the world, you can manipulate design to show status or craft specialization. They are an aspect of the object language, but they're not the whole part of the object language. You need the whole shape, and then we need the whole group. So looking at our lives through our objects requires sensitivity to what are the groups that are important in our lives and how, when we find them, they're balanced. In this case, I would argue that we learn more by looking at these things. I said at the beginning that the man was in the military. He'd been fighting, and in fact, his body is severely damaged by fighting, by war. Here you find his major weapon, which is an axe, and that derives ultimately from the jade axes of the Neolithic period. Now, if we were to show this simply to a Western audience, they would be surprised that an axe was his major weapon. They would expect to see some sort of dagger or sword. And it's very few people who seem to notice that the Chinese method of fighting and the Western method of fighting are just different. And the axe is far more important and long available before the sword becomes significant in China. I'm not going to discuss why the sword is a late arrival and where it comes from, but I think it shows immediately that we should be sensitive to the differences, and it's useful to know the differences between one culture and another. One of the differences is, of course, in these knives. Knives are useful for people with animals. And of course, what I'm going to say is that this man, Ya Chang, as he's known from the inscription on his weapons and on his vessels, some of his vessels, is in fact a fighter, and I'm going to say he's a chariot leader. He has 3 rather unusual knives. This one with a very realistic horse's head may have been cast at Anyang, but this one with a broken horn of a stag and a large eye is probably likely to have come from Mongolia or from Inner Mongolia, as possibly this one did too. But they almost certainly came from areas that were in contact with China, with central China, because the Mongolian area has very little bronze, whereas China has a lot. What gives the role of this man away, perhaps above all, are these chariot fittings. These are worn at the waist, probably, and could have reins wound around them so that the chariot driver can use his weapons. And they have two features that are not actually typical of Anyang casting, namely the horse's head and the jingle. So that is a very interesting aspect of casting in China, of bronze use in China at this moment. The casters could be directed to do things in a way that was suitable for the north, the lowest plateau or Inner Mongolia, but is not suitable really for central China, though they do make them abundantly for chariot tombs, chariot driver tombs. We know that the man buried was in some degree linked with chariots because his name is here inscribed and filled with tiny turquoise plaques to show his name clearly on one of these chariot items. So these tools on the left are also for woodwork or material connected with chariots. Some people occasionally say they're for agriculture. I think it's extremely unlikely. They are probably connected with repairing or looking after chariots. He also has three other objects. I mean, I've chosen from a huge number, a gold disc, a jade bead, of which he had many, and a palette in stone with collar. So that the importance of these objects is that it shows us he is not a standard member of the elite. He is a man associated with chariots. Now, what is significant is his burial position. He's not buried in the royal cemetery. He's not buried in one of the lineage cemeteries which are here. He's buried near the temples and palaces at Shaotun, where Fu Hao, the consort of one of the kings, is also buried. And she too has a very unusual burial. Because hers is one of the richest burials ever found at Anyang, people don't say it's a bit strange. It is a bit strange. She has a very large number of vessels, many of them with other people's or other posthumous names. And they suggest that the bronzes have been given to her for some particular social or hierarchical reason, and a huge number of cowries. So two individuals here are not usual burials. There are some other elite burials, but they have very few objects. These are the two with the most. And they're also buried near several chariot burials. This is an early plan from an excavation at what is called M20 in the area. So we have near the palaces and ritual temples, perhaps, we have Fu Hao, we have Chang and his burial, and we have other chariot burials. And in the chariot burials, you see again what we have already noticed. We have the arc, which is for winding reins, and we have knives with animal heads here, so that the chariot burial chimes with the burial we've just looked at Chang, and also with exactly the same material in Fu Hao's burial. She, like Chang, has these animal vessels. He only has one buffalo, and he also has a very amusing and interesting gung vessel, and they seem to be indicative of their high status. They're also items that have links with the south. Which side copied the other is not so clear, but they are exceptional vessels, and Chang has, therefore, despite his much lower status than Fu Hao, a very exceptional vessel. Now, having perhaps said something about the objects that present us with information and tell us what the people of the time thought, because after all, the language we're looking at is the language expressed by the people of the day, not my language or your language. It's not this curator's language or this archaeologist's language. It is evidence of the objects and their purpose and their meaning to the people of the time. We can now, though, take this idea where we've seen Ya Cheng with his contacts with the north. He's almost certainly someone who's come south or whose ancestors have come south down the Yellow River to Anyang. I'm now going to look at a quite different tomb much later. Instead of 1200 BC, we're now moving to around 750 BC. And here we have on the edge of the lowest plateau, the tomb of a lord of the Zhou dynasty and of the Ji family. So he's very central to the Zhou enterprise, but he's no longer in the Wei Valley. He's certainly left the Wei Valley, though his family may have come from part of it. We are now in meeting a very grand tomb. This is an enormous tomb for a lord as opposed to a member of the royal family or the imperial family. It's particularly deep. The depth that you can dig in the lowest area is quite extraordinary. And at 13.2 meters, this is a very, very deep tomb. And for the period, one of the deepest. There are deeper ones in this area or a bit further north, but this is a very deep tomb, and presumably the depth expressed his status. There are no very good pictures of the total tomb excavated. The center is well illustrated, but it's a complete and unlooted tomb, and he is buried there alongside, in a cemetery, alongside two women who are probably his consort or his concubine, and a man who is probably his son or close relative. He was exceptionally wealthy, and we can see that in his bronzes. He looked back to his past with his heirlooms. This is an ancient shape. He had several hundred jades, and he had a very extraordinary item, this set of gold, which showed he was in contact with his northern neighbors. And very likely, the gold came from the north. You can't excavate gold in the lowest plateau. That's really out of the question. So it's very likely that it comes by exchange with people further north. This tomb in the 8th century is also important for bronze knives with iron blades. And this is the very beginning of the use of iron as a weapon. Here, to show his status, I give you a picture of, this is the tomb of the Lord of Ray here. This is the tomb of his consort. This is from the tomb of one of his other consorts or concubines. And this is from an adjacent tomb of his son or another member of the Ji group of Ray. And I compare them here with an earlier tomb from Liulihe near Beijing. And you can see the kinds of vessels have changed dramatically. And this is something I've written about extensively, and I think we should take very seriously, because I think it's indicative of an upheaval in the Zhou period. After all, this Lord of Ray has left the Wei Valley and is now very near the center of the Yellow River at Hancheng at Liangdaisun. And so he's no longer in the Wei Valley area and has moved towards the east as the Zhou king has had to move. There's a lot of debate about how he moved and a lot of discussion about rebellions in his court. But I wonder if it isn't really just the pressure from the north. The northerners have moved in again and again, the Zhou, after all, may be among them, and then have become the leaders. And so the pressure in the Wei Valley has become too great, and all of the elites and the Zhou king have moved east. So this is a tomb and a series of bronzes at that moment. And they are certainly quite different from the earlier ones. There has certainly been a deliberate change, and that the objects are telling us that this is a deliberate change, and that the whole clan or family has followed is important evidence of the role of these vessels in the family or the clan, but also an important evidence of the continuation of the ritual of offerings to the dead. So we have both continuity and dramatic change taking place at once, and we should accept that as an important feature of China of the time. One of the things we learn about from looking at the tombs and seeing what they tell us in a different kind of visual language is that we can see upheavals very clearly. It has even fazed specialists in Chinese history that these two pictures show a change, and that is not an accidental change. Someone made a deliberate decision to move from this kind of ding to this kind of ding, and to this series of similar ding, and the use of numbers of ding to show status. So that the decisions in China, nothing is like this is haphazard. This is a deliberate change from one form of ritual performance to a quite other one. It's also not possible to say it's by chance. The Lord of Ray, the man in this tomb, owned this bronze. This is a clear replica of this kind of bronze, which was found in Western China at the turn of in the 11th century, when the Zhou conquered or came to power. So this is a replica. It's not an original. It's a replica imitating bronzes that had been owned by the family earlier. It's probably older than the tomb. It's probably quite old, but it's very important to show us that not only had there been a change in vessel, but that the change was recognized and appreciated and understood. And so that we learn from this that instead of seeing a text that describes this, we see it happening actually in bronze. We actually see that something has happened, that an important decision has been made, it has been implemented, and even, if you like, treated as precious by the owner of a new set of bronzes, retaining the old one. So that looking at the material, we hear words and see movement that we cannot see in a text. No text of the Zhou period will explain that there was this upheaval that led to a change in vessel shape. We learn about upheavals, we learn about rebellions, we learn about movement towards Luoyang, but we don't learn about how they decided to make a new vessel type. So that looking at the objects does give us an entry into a different kind of language, a language which they could read and we can sort of read, but not as well, in the physical items that were around them. And when we look at our rooms, at the studies I work in, or the kitchens I've shown you, we know that we understand how what the books will tell us, what the saucepans do. And so too, in this day of the 8th century, the man who owned this bronze and who was buried with it knew in some indirect way that it reflected a much earlier type of bronze used in the 11th century, therefore several centuries earlier, in his homeland near Baoji. Here we have the jades, and these are much earlier jades which have been, the collapse here of the Liangzhu culture spread these jades across China with imitations being made, and the Lord owns some of these imitations, but he uses them in his own way. They are no longer part of the Liangzhu culture here 1,000 years or more earlier. And as important are the gold items. The gold tells us that he is in contact with people in the north. And the people in the north are buried like this. This is a very famous tomb, one of the most famous tombs in the steppe, Arjan II, and the man has a belt with wonderful S-shaped plaques, and somewhat earlier, the Lord of Ray must have been in contact with people who had gold belts and also gold armlets, a gold scabbard. And this man in the steppe also had a gold decorated iron blade and a little tiger. So here is the material from the steppe, and here is the imitation of it, or the way it was brought to the edge of China, to Yuhuangmiao near Beijing. And we can see in the fact that the belt at Yuhuangmiao copies the belt at Arjan that there is very close contact. So what this tomb has told us is quite complicated. It's told us that there's been a change in vessel type, probably due to a big upheaval in the court. This is not a minor change. It shows that jade is still very popular and very important, but no longer has the same meaning as it held in the Neolithic period. And we have to accept that we're looking at a material that is very stable, that doesn't change when buried, and lose its original meaning and gains new ones. So while the vessels retain their meaning, the jade loses the original one and gains new meanings. And then we have this outlier, this extraordinary gold belt, gold scabbard, gold bangles, a thumb ring for archery, and ornaments. And this must have come from further north. The gold must have come from further north. And the idea of using it must be news from his neighbors, probably. The neighbors of the Lord of Ray were outsiders who were not of the Zhou clan, and he was obviously imitating them. So we see a moment of change, a moment of on the cusp, and he must have talked about it. There must have been decisions made by ritual specialists to put these different things in this enormous tomb. So that when we look at objects, we know that there is discussion. We know that they had ritual, even religious meaning for their owners. We know that they also showed contact. So that there is a very clear evidence of a material that would have had names, which would have had discussion, and nobody, as we have just witnessed a big royal funeral, nobody in burying such a man in this grand tomb would have treated any of these things lightly. They would have all had symbolic or family connotations, which is why I showed you a symbolic set of objects at the very beginning. I'm now going to end here very quickly with something from much earlier work, The Lotus and the Dragon Book, to show you that you can look at a big change that takes place in China with the fall of the Han Dynasty, the arrival of Buddhism, and a visual overwhelming of the arrangements of vessels and of religious implements by a decorative scheme, a visual system that comes from the West. But it does not change the language of objects, really. It changes their decoration, it changes the visual system, but it doesn't change the beliefs. So here we have a vessel from the steppe, from the Scythians in the West, in Ukraine, as it happens. There are the horses and the people of Ukraine. And here is what is called a palmette in Western language, and it alternates with the lotus in many Western Asian and Egyptian decoration. And there they make this into a scroll with flowers. This is a version of the same scroll. The undulations go backwards and forwards, and this comes from Inner Mongolia and this from China. And here we see the same undulations, the same use of alternating flowers on a basin of the Yuan dynasty. This is an important blue and white porcelain from the British Museum, which I've known all my working life. And these are, they could be lotuses, but they could also be peonies. So this is the material, the way in which it came. These did not get transferred. The motif was not transferred by itself. It came with architecture. And it is found in architecture. Here is Palmyra in the Syrian desert. Here is Petra in the Jordan desert. Here is Yungang with the columns that they have taken from the West. And they've come primarily with Buddhism. So here's Petra again, and there you see the columns and the ornament is carved into the rock. It is not freestanding. And it can be transferred and was transferred with Buddhism to Pakistan and Afghanistan here with images in the Buddha enclosed in arches with imitation columns. This is a real column with an acanthus decoration, but it's carved, it's not standing free. And here it is in Gandhara in Pakistan. And we see it then repeated at Yungang. And so this is a transfer that I've discussed in great detail, and it brought with it all these ornaments. The ornaments did not travel separately. They traveled as part of a whole complex of ideas and of decoration and of carving, but not exactly building. So here is the big Buddha, seated Buddha at Yungang. But more important to my argument here is the wall in one of the caves where the figure is enclosed in an arch. And round the arch, you see these ornaments. Here is one of those undulating scrolls. So this is the kind of scroll that you see just here. So these scrolls have exact parallels in Western Asia and then turn up here, carried on imagery, portable imagery probably, to Yungang and engraved, carved in these caves. I've discussed this in great detail in my book, The Lotus and the Dragon, but I just want to show it as a visual system which now gets accommodated in the existing system for burial, if you like. Here the same scroll occurs on a mirror. But here you see this peony scroll as part of the architecture. It has come into Chinese architecture. This is a column in wood with a dogang. This is not a Western capital. This is a Chinese one, and it's in a famous group of tombs northwest of Beijing. So in some ways, it's rather easy to concentrate on the ornament and think that's so important. But we should remember that the same idea that existed in the Bronze Age exists now, here in the Liao period. The tombs are providing the dead person, the tomb occupant who's in a coffin here on this platform. This is the rear chamber with items for the future in his afterlife. Here are the pens for writing. Here are women carrying implements. And the front room has the things we've seen before. It has the preparation for meals, and it has the musical instruments for ceremonial and entertainment, so that we haven't changed the set of objects conveying the meaning or purpose of the tomb are still there. They've been upgraded in time. They've been changed in time to porcelains we would recognize, lacquer boxes we would recognize from this Liao period, to musical instruments, but they haven't changed. The purpose of the tomb is the same as it was in the Bronze Age, to provide the implements and objects that are needed for the full life in the afterlife. Here in this part of the world, on the edge of the lowest plateau, they needed a horse, so that we are bound into the same religious belief, but it is upgraded or changed in style, so that the objects of the day are used, not the objects of the past. And here, finally, I end with a slide that shows you the actual objects on an offering in front of the coffin in the same group of tombs. This is not the same tomb. The other pictures were all from the same tomb. This is another tomb of the same group. It has still this peony scroll, has here the development of auspicious imagery. This is a crane, an auspicious bird. And here we have the offerings to the dead in the form of nourishing food. I show you also a picture of the British Museum in a newly rearranged case to emphasize that actually when we look at individual objects, when we treat them as very special individually, we may not be getting the full point. The West finds it hard to understand why China has such wonderful ceramics. What the people in the West do not know is, first of all, they're used in life, in sets, by very high-ranking people. And secondly, they're used in offerings to people for the future afterlife. So that the way we place them in museums is as, if you like, the books on a shelf. But in order to read the text of the books on the shelf, we need to look at the tombs, we need to study the past, we need to look also at the technology of these fantastic ceramics to understand why they're there and what the people who made them thought. And I think that we underestimate what was intended. We don't look at the whole assemblage. And China is actually unique in having this very, very long history of fantastically large tombs, developed first in the north, in the Loess Plateau, and continued usually on a smaller scale in the south, where often lacquer is used in place of ceramics. These are assemblages with meaning, purpose, and language. They tell the person who put them there, the people of the day, what they were for. So it is a great honor to have had this opportunity to show you visually, because my ideas and research have mainly been visual. And I want to renew my thanks to the Tang Foundation, to the founder of the Tang Foundation and the Tang Prize, and thank them profoundly for awarding me this honor, the Tang Prize in Sinology. I must also thank all of you in the foundation who have worked so hard on this enterprise, not just for me, but for other laureates, but have also made possible this wonderful occasion today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for the amazing talk, Professor Rawson. I would also like to take a moment to remind our audiences that we will be taking questions during the panel discussion. If you have any questions that you would like to ask, please scan the QR code on the screen or click on the Slido link below the live stream channel. We will be taking questions through this online platform. Thank you. To begin the panel discussion, let's welcome today's moderator, Professor David Dewey Wang, and panelists Professor Chen Fangmei, Professor Li Yongdi, and Professor Shi Jingfei. Professor Wang, Professor Chen, and Professor Shi, please join us on stage. Professor Li is joining us live from the US, and Professor Jessica Rawson will be joining us live from the UK. Welcome.
Okay, I think we will start the discussion part of today's forum. And again, Professor Rawson, on behalf of the audience here in Taipei, I would like to express our appreciation for your wonderful talk, which is truly inspiring and extremely informative for a layman member of the audience like myself. So definitely I've learned quite a bit from your presentation. And now, without further ado, may I introduce our panelists for today's discussion, Professor Chen Fangmei and Professor Li Yongdi, who is actually online with us. I think we are seeing him now on the screen. I don't know where you are in the United States, somewhere, Chicago or wherever. So thank you so much, and also Professor Lai. Yeah, and we would like to invite each of our panelists to give a short presentation, either making their observations or raising questions to engage with Professor Rawson. And after that, we will open the floor to the audience here, and hopefully we will solicit the very interesting questions for further discussion and dialogue between Taipei and Oxford. So, Professor Chen.
谢谢Rawson 教授呢，希望我来担任他的那个唐奖的那个演讲者的语坛人。受时间的限制呢，我只能从他那种时空跨度非常博大多元的研究中呢，选择东西交通还有青铜器这2方面呢，从他的材料、议题还有研究方法这3个角度呢来力托他的学术贡献，还有举出一点小问题来就请教他。我们从东西交通的议题来说呢，当然那个上古黄河、长江2流域的文明跟北方文明的关系呢，事实上是近100年来已经引起学者的就是学术界一直非常有兴趣。1954年李继之先生呢，他就提过，就是说中国2000年来的史学家呢上了秦始皇的一个大当，把中国古史呢看作长城以南的事情。那1962年呢，他也提出说是殷商青铜器文化呢来源中有一部分呢，我认为是跟2河流域，也就是中亚、西亚的有非常密切的关系。但是那时候他提出说是这一些问题的解决呢，需要更广阔的田野考古工作，还有更深度的那个比较研究。确实呢，随着考古的锄头呢，我们看到就是1971年Professor William Watson 他Culture Frontier 就提出这个 Frontier 的那个概念，然后随着这样子的一些那个到那个 Rawson 教授呢我们看到他他所为我们所画出来的那样子的一个交流的现象呢，已经是非常丰富，而且甚至于就是更具象化、更那个 lively 这样子哦。那特别是像他那个几篇非常精彩的在那个东西交通方面的那个文章里头，我们看那个他从在时间上呢从那个安阳就是差不多西元前12世纪，一直到那个西周这个时间上的那个跨度呢那个他几乎都有涉猎，也找到了很多的证据。然后呢在那个证据的那个充实方面呢也举证的越来越多。我们看他那个特别像那个2010那个红玛瑙珠那种那个动物塑像，还有异域风格的那些器物的那些例证里头呢，都是非常非常的特别是那个红玛瑙珠的那个说服力呢非常的深。那个刚刚他提到那个马车，还有马具。还有连带的那个人还有那个使用的兵器还有马车上面的那些器具呢，整个已经是从点到线到面这样子那个给我们的视野呢是相当的开阔。那所举的例证呢也相当的严密，跳脱了所谓的中心跟那个周边的那种思想框架，让那个欧亚大陆呢不同地区之间的互动关系呢更加立体。他的研究呢从那我现在呢只是想要举出一点问题想要那个请教那个 Rawson 教授。就是他从装饰品到兵器到车马器到墓葬形式，来说明那个就是这种欧亚草原所扮演的角色，还有就是欧亚之间的文化交流的现象。那在这样子的不同性质的这一些物当中呢，它的那个物的说明能力还有说明性质呢，事实上是有一些，是不是也是要在程度上、在能力上做一些区分，然后在那个包括异域风格怎么样来界定有些 有些从那个就是资历发展，还有那个就是文化交流这样子的解释框架里头到底程度上是一个怎么样的那个？有些譬如说是在那个器物方面在那个有些在研究上假使只看到某一个部分的时候，可能会觉得是异域风格。可是当放到某一些框架，又发现事实上本身的智力发展的一些材料呢，似乎会让那个异域风格的那种认定呢，感觉到有一些摇动或者是怎么样。所以这里面的那个呢他是不是有碰到这样子的一个问题？那是不是要做一些更进一步的那个厘清？像红马老猪这是有矿源的问题，有什么那个就是很开门见山的。可是，在那个在铜容器方面呢，这个铜容器是一个中远发展的一个很核心的项目啦。那在在这样子的一个框架里头呢？去界定它是外来或者是跟本地有关系的这种纠葛呢，之间的纠葛呢，就有些是比较不容易那个看得非常清楚啦。在这一方面呢，就是也牵涉到一些历史解释方面的一些问题啦。这是我的第一个问题哦。然后另一方面刚刚那个Rawson教授也谈到那个就是很久远的一些传统，在后来被保留他特别在那个复古的问题上呢有很多篇的文章讨论到。那是复古方面呢他甚至于把那个就是归纳出复古的几个形态出来这个是把那种从现象去理论化呢，是一个很重要的一个贡献，很重要的贡献。那在这边呢我个人也觉得他用甚至于做那种复古，想到那个青铜器的传统对那个青铜器能够从上古一直到近现代都还保留那种很多一些形制还有纹饰方面都还存在。这样子一个现象呢，让他非常的那个，他也做了很多的解释很多解释。那在这一方面呢我个人也有一些台湾的经验就是在台南孔庙呢看到就是有乾隆纪年的那一种也是一套的那种祭器1774年的纪年的时候，那这样子的祭器呢，形制纹饰跟那个商周是非常的像，非常像。这个呢确实是哪些人、哪些事、哪些物，让这样子的形制纹饰活了3000年，然后让这样形制纹饰呢，甚至于也越过黑水沟来到台湾。这背后所牵涉到的人事物这就像那个 Rawson 讲的，事实上是要去经过解释、经过说明这样子的。那这样子的这些人事物确实从那边也看到了不只是苏州来的台湾知府蒋元枢，看到乾隆皇帝，我们看到甚至于更早的朱熹，还有欧阳修、刘畅这些人。事实上，都在这里面都出了一些力，占了一些那个。那像这样子的一个这样子的一个，甚至于在那个日本的德川幕府，在韩国的李朝他们也是有这样子的一个，用这样子的那个的这样子的一些相近的祭器在祭祀在。那这样子的一个现象，复古现象里头所谓的现在大家想要是不是在那个艺术史里头，应该有一个所谓的儒教美术这样子的一个概念出来就是它事实上它反映了 在艺术史中的重要现象。那在那个Rawson 教授的那个复古的那样子的一个研究当中，他如何看待这样子的一个可能性，还有这样子的一个一个儒教在这一方面所扮演的那个角色好，谢谢。
Okay, let me just say a few words to summarize Professor Chen's observation, just for Professor Rawson and for our guest, Professor Lee, in the United States. Basically, two questions. The first one has to do with Professor Chen's concern about how Professor Rawson could develop a much more nuanced investigation into the variation and, say, differentiations among the objects under study, from the ornamentations in the ancient times to bronze objects and eventually to other artifacts manufactured and presented in later times. Through this very macro approach, Professor Rawson has already made some really very inspiring and general observations about the continuation and sometimes of consistency of the art designs and the conceptual frameworks underneath those designs. Professor Chen's question has to do with how Professor Rawson could really further her study in light of the changes and the continuities of time, so as to make a more nuanced differentiations of all those objects under study from time to time, from generation to generation, and from region to region. Right? The second question has to do with the dialogue between modernity and antiquity. We all know that Professor Rawson is a specialist in very ancient civilizations in China and other civilizations. But according to Professor Chen's field work, even in recent years, she has come to notice some more recent presentation, either artistic presentations or architectural presentations, monumental presentations, which seem to bring some imprints of classical or classicist engagement, either conceptually or artistically. So she's very curious about how we could bring our discoveries of ancient civilizations to bear upon with more recent restorations and reinventions of those classicist motifs in our modern times. And in summation, probably she was curious, Professor Chen is curious about the possibility or the feasibility of the so-called Confucian art or artistic systems in transculturations, not only in Taiwan, but also in China and also in Japan and Korea, where there's such a kind of circulation of classicist motifs in modern times, either in terms of restoration or reinvention. Thank you. Maybe we should invite Professor Rawson to answer these questions now, or should we just let's finish our first round of presentation so that Professor Rawson could answer our questions in more general terms. Would that be all right, Professor Rawson?
Well, it depends how long. I mean,
okay.
I might forget.
I think we still have about 40 minutes or so. So probably I would personally suggest that we go ahead with Professor Lee's comments so that Professor Rawson will have a little more time to think over Professor Chen's and other professors' comments and give us a sort of general answers in the interest of our time. Would that be all right?
Okay.
All right. Okay, so we will have Professor Lee from the United States. Please go ahead.
If you can hear me, my comments will be short. It's a great honor to be able to participate in today's event, the celebration of Professor Rawson's lifetime academic achievement and the recognition of her contribution to the study of ancient China. I've known Professor Rawson for many years, since I was a grad student. I was telling my son, now 15, the other day, that he met Professor Rawson when he was 5 or 4. Fresh as a daisy. That was Professor Rawson's remark when she saw my son running around in academia synagogue after spending a full day in kindergarten. My son, being a teenager now and speaking only American English, looked entirely baffled when he heard me repeating the British saying. Throughout the years, I've always been amazed by the scope of Professor Rawson's research and the innovative and original approaches he has been able to bring forth. Today's lecture fully demonstrates the kind of research Professor Rawson has been doing for years. The incredible temporal depth, the vast geographic regions covered, the multiplicity and variety of the topics discussed, and the cross-cultural and comparative perspectives applied. To achieve any of these three approaches requires tremendous efforts, and Professor Rawson has mastered all three. And this is all done alongside her busy schedule for administrative tasks and for teaching and mentoring the many students she has. To me, after listening to Professor Rawson's presentation today, the one big question or a series of questions I have is not about the facts or interpretations in the research. What I would like to ask Professor Rawson is, what is the secret of being able to come up with one original research idea after another? What would be your advice to students and budding scholars alike to develop such an eye or mindset for new research topics? And how does one prepare oneself to become ready for the kind of comparative approaches you have demonstrated in your study? These questions are easy and at the same time hard to answer. But perhaps you could reflect a little bit upon your own experiences and share with us how you have achieved this kind of scholarship you now have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Lee. And our third panelist, Professor Shi Jingfei from National Taiwan University. Professor Shi.
Okay, thank you, Professor Wang, for the kind introduction and for moderating today's event. It is an immense pleasure and privilege to take part in today's forum to discuss one of Professor Rawson's newest concept with Professor Rawson, my advisor at Oxford, as well as lifelong mentor, as well as Professor Chen and another lifelong mentor and friends, and my colleague, Professor Lee. As Professor Rawson's student who does not work on early China, and I hope to add a different perspective to today's discussion. I will first share my experience working with Professor Rawson and look into the idea of an object language. And then I will provide comments or raise questions on the issue. So I need more time. And I prepare a PPT. So there are the other two students in the audience today, Wu Xiaoyun from the National Palace Museum and Maggie Wang from Chinese University, Hong Kong. And they may also help to join the discussion during the Q&A section. So when I went to work with Professor Rawson at Oxford University in late 90s, I had the chance to learn from her important studies on objects published in the 80s and 90s, which are now put together with the more advanced idea of a language of objects. We should bear in mind that these studies are very pioneering, especially at a time when the archaeological materials were limited and the research approaches were relatively conservative, though some of these concepts may now have become common sense and common approaches today. And we might not always agree with each other. So these three important studies are in turn recognized today as her key contribution. The first one is the ritual revolution in Western Zhou period, how the change of quality of making, size, shape, decoration, skill, and manufacture process from Shang to Xizhou marked the ritual revolution in Western Zhou period. You have heard the research in her lecture and by the comments of Professor Chen, and I will not spend time on this issue. Next. And the next one is the set, assemblage of objects in Song Dynasty halls and tombs. Her study on the set and the relationship between ceramics and silver objects of Tang, Song, and Yuan periods has deeply inspired my main research subject of later Chinese crafts. That is to see objects not only as individual items or museum masterpieces, but as groups or sets in their setting and co-relationship with each other and with their users. The very first article I wrote in my academic career has clearly shown the approach inspired by her pioneering study on seeing objects. And now it still stands as one of my favorite works. So now, so I learned how to see this object in context, in a proper context. So I wrote my dissertation on Yuan blue and white. So she asked me to do the table of different halls and tombs and try to see the relationship between the different types of objects and to see how they, not just vessel types, but also the decoration. They may supplement or replace with each other. So that's a set of, to see them in set or see them in scenes. How the contemporary people using this object together to break up to broke the boundary between different materials and disciplines. Okay, the third one is the Chinese ornament, lotus and dragon. You heard this a lot in her lecture. And that's her important publication on Chinese ornament in 1984. And the Chinese version was published in 2019. Next one. And I will have more to say about the study of Chinese ornament here. I cannot describe how exciting I was when I first read her book on Chinese ornament. It is like I discovered a whole new world, and it then became the direction of studies that I decided to devote my life to working with. As a young student back then, studying Chinese ornament in Taiwan, I was indeed very lost and not satisfied with most of the past studies in which ornament was often taken for granted. Most of the studies were either trying to explain the auspicious meaning only or to see the visual development of individual patterns without consideration of their cause or correlations with each other. That means the knowledge cannot be generated and accumulated. So like you can see on the slide here, we have I learned from the past studies that on your left-hand side, you see the dragon of the Yongde period, and then you see dragon in the next period is Shende period. So we were told to see the differentiation of the different dragons. For example, in the case of a Shende, you see the spiky hair of dragon, which is different from the Yongde one. And the next one, and then this is dragon of Zheng period. So you would be told or trained to memorize, and then I like the game as well. I like the game. When my teacher asked me to guess which one is which period, but this kind of knowledge of memory cannot be generated as knowledge or accumulated to do further research, I'm afraid. Next one. So therefore, when I first encountered lotus and dragon, it felt like, bingo, that's exactly the approach I'm looking for. And I'm glad I was able to help with the Chinese version published in 2019. Next one. To read through the whole book again. Next one. Instead of looking at individual patterns or auspicious association merely, Professor Rawson explored the entire journey of plants motifs from Egypt through West and South Asia to China, and then further to Korea and Japan, and so to pinpoint a system behind Chinese ornament. There is a language / system of ornaments. You could find their distribution and development over time and space. You will then reconsider the flower or the plant's decoration. The flower scrolls on yuan blue and white porcelain. Next one. Is actually a hybrid pattern with a long tradition developed over time and space. Next one. They have a foreign origin and were then absorbed into new tradition after Tang Dynasty. So that's Yungang, and then, yeah. This blue and white dish has housed in a palace museum. Palace collection, Istanbul, Turkey. You might say, no wonder the decoration taste was much welcome in the West Asia because of the early visual tradition. Next one. And if I am able to explain further her study on Chinese ornaments a little more, here is a brief introduction to see where she stands from Sepper to Regal and Gombrich. And if you were, and then Professor Rawson's The System of Chinese Ornament we have just seen. So if I could conclude the above discussion here, the Rawsonian studies, named by Professor Robert Harris in the Columbia University, is 3 points I want to make here. Is one, first, a broader view. She examined objects in a closed material and closed region context. Professor Rawson's extensive experience at the British Museum set the foundation that allowed her to cultivate a broad vision and conduct research considering different materials and extensive geographic spaces. A second, relationship, or we can call organic relationships, not to read objects alone, but to read them in proper context. Relationship between different objects, including set, assemblage, composition, and system, and between object and people. The third one is the movement or scene. Ritual performance with object, like she just explained, the revolution in ritual vessels in Western Zhou period. Usage or function of object in daily life, not seeing object in their fixed forms, and also usage of object in their, and also political performance on stage. For example, the Three Emperors exhibition in London, curated by her. She liked to see how objects help to construct the political stages of the three emperors, Kangxi, Yongzheng, and Qianlong. Okay. Now let's come back to today's lecture. I'm struck and impressed by a sentence in this fabulous lecture by Professor Rawson. On the slide 13, she said, they are writing his, Ya Chang's, biography in objects, like as they could have written it in words. I'm wondering, can we write someone's biography in object, and how? So it seems to us that such a method is more effective in cultures or periods that lack textual evidence, as shown in Professor Rawson's lecture for the early period in China. And I'm wondering whether we could explain the idea to the nomadic groups without writing systems, minorities in societies, females, and of course, ornaments. for which there are not enough written sources to explore their history. The language of object would be much more helpful to reconstructing their history. Okay, and my next question is, as Professor Rawson said in her lecture, quote, to read the objects, we need background knowledge, both of the received history and of craft technology, end quote. This implies associations, networks, cultural backgrounds, and we have to be able to read this message behind the scene or objects we saw. So how can scholars or students learn to read the language of objects in proper context? How do we understand the grammars of objects' language? How do scholar or student recognize that Ya Chang's tomb, the buffalo, is exceptional? What kind of craft is required to read the object language proposed by Professor Rawson? So the craft, the craft here, like technology and style, material, skill, form, decoration, all together to see the internal logic of objects. So I'm very conscious or concerned about this question. If it takes several years to learn to write or speak certain languages, not to mention that these languages have mature and much more mature and well-developed grammar system over years. So how many years is required for you to learn to be able to read such languages? Okay, conclusion. I think I will stop here. For the Chinese readers who would like to know further details of her study, I will recommend beginning with the article that I wrote with Wu Xiaoyun for the celebration of her retirement as warden of Merton College in 2012. And the very last picture I would like to show you, also from this article, is Professor Rawson's picture with the just passed Queen Elizabeth. Professor Rawson, in her career as a curator, has met Her Majesty, the Queen, several times in the openings of important exhibitions of new galleries. That is one of them. When I was worried about what to wear yesterday, what to wear today, and look for something in my wardrobe, I saw this picture and immediately a bell rang. This is the one. Her inspiration to me is really everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Shi. Very touching photo, definitely a wonderful moment for us to share. And now, Professor Rawson, I hope the questions aren't too many for you. But anyway, the floor is yours. Thank you, Professor Rawson.
Thank you very much. Really, it's difficult to answer all this in different ways. Perhaps I could say that you wonder how I look at things like this, and Professor Lee's view, how do I reach these conclusions? I think there are two important things in my life. I think it has been important to be a foreigner. I do not take China for granted. I had to spend years and years learning first Chinese, and then it took a long time before it was possible to travel in China. So I would say being foreign means, and being held back, being restricted, being told you can't go to China, has also meant that I've had to build my own castle, if you like. And the British Museum was a wonderful place because not only were there Chinese objects, but there's this whole range of Western Asia and Egypt. And I think some of my interest in China and my ability to make suggestions, I don't know if they're answers, but suggestions, comes from being challenged every day. When I walk through the Greek galleries and the Egyptian galleries, what do I see but a culture that is not China? Then I go to China. And I think more important than perhaps you who are on the other side know is that the division between us is geographical. We do not join up at the Western Asian level. You have to travel north through the steppe to get to China if you're in Europe, and the other way back. So the Chinese today have built the Belt and Road Initiative, and they're also building the sea route. Now, that shows you just how complex the contact is and how different our two cultures are. So I think I've been aided by the British Museum and the difference of our cultures. Some of the questions raised by Professor Chen, I'm not completely sure how to answer the first one, but I think you may find the book, when it is finally published in summer next year, a bit helpful. I have a chapter, each chapter is about a tomb, and this was chosen by the publisher, but is helpful in forcing a contemplation or contrast, emphasis on context. What does this person own and why? And one of the important things about the jade, and I think perhaps I certainly didn't get that across, is the jades start in the East, and it is very surprising. They do not start in the West. They do not start with the Kunlun Mountains. They start in the East, and so they are also destroyed in the East. The cultures that had the jades collapsed, and are very much more ancient than the big cultures of the Yellow River. So what reaches the Yellow River is a distribution, both by people moving deliberately from the East to the center, but also by chance distribution, people moving, people copying. So on that map I showed you, many of the Tsung were copies. So China has a remarkable jade culture, but it's remarkable because no one at any time understood it. So it's unlike the bronze culture, which is written about and discussed endlessly in society. They didn't understand their jade culture. It was a mystery. So they gave it new interpretations every generation. So I would separate the jades as very special from the bronze culture and from the later cultures interacting with the steppe. And it has acquired a religious, almost sacred position in the culture because it is disconnected from its heritage. And then each dynasty, each period adopted the jades, used them in their own ways, and so it became a layered culture, quite different from the bronzes. In the bronzes, they could go back to inscriptions, they could started to publish them again, maybe they got them right, maybe they got them wrong, but there was a much clearer line. In the case of jade, it's different. So in my book, I certainly separate the jades, the early jades, from the later bronzes, and then I show the jades reappearing in later tombs, in different ways. Whereas the bronzes, you can almost see that there was a decision made to change the bronze set. So I do think, as Professor Chen has raised, there is a retro style in bronzes because there could be. They could look at them and decide what they thought they meant and revive them actually more as incense burners or status symbols than as food vessels. The food vessels had changed. I'm sorry, I'm losing my voice. Anyway, for those two questions, I would certainly separate the jades from the bronzes and later things, and I would certainly say that China has a very important retro style, which can be documented. But in both cases, I say the reason I perhaps have raised this issue of a language of objects is because I have worked on these tombs for 2 or 3 years, writing a chapter about each, and I have tried to see how the objects belong to a particular life. And then I look at my own room and think, how do these objects? And so the stories you can tell about objects differ from your perspective. If you're the tomb owner, you have one set of object comments. If you're the tomb preparer, the ritual specialist, you'll have another. If you're the tomb excavator, you have a third one. But this is true if you read a book. if I read a book, if I read a Chinese story and you read a Chinese story, you have different responses. So that actually the human response in physical and in verbal form is very varied. And one of our gifts is our ability to manage this variation. If we couldn't manage the variation, we couldn't communicate. Now, I do think there is a failure on the Western side to understand the Chinese side, but I think it would be stronger and easier to get together if in China you were willing to recognize that you have not only different characteristics, but a different culture. And that culture has a language in words, a language in choreography. What I came to with the ritual vessels was you have to think of a choreography, because the handling of the vessels in the Lord of Ray's tomb is quite different from the handling of the vessels in Ya Chang's tomb, completely different. They cannot be used in the same way. The numbers are different, the foods will be different, the sequence is different. So as well as a visual, looking at objects, we look at them, we know what they're for, they have a functional meaning, they have a biography themselves, but they have a choreography. I think all these things matter in trying to construct what I call an object language. It's not easy, but how does one, I do think, answering Professor Lee's question, that the comparison was helpful. By working in the British Museum and every day passing Egypt or Greece, I realized we were not looking at the same inventory. If you don't want to talk about a language, you can always talk about an inventory. We all have inventories of what is suitable in our different societies. And I realized that China has a different inventory and to some extent is underestimated. So one of the differences between China and the West is the absence of stone in China and the presence of stone, particularly in Egypt. But what happens in the West is the stone is copied by the Greeks and copied by the Romans and then is unearthed in the medieval period, and that's why we use stone. It's not because stone is better, it's just chance. And the one important feature which I explore in my book is, of course, with the lowest plateau, you have an obstruction. It's an obstruction to the stone, and it's a big obstruction to metal. But because of the dispersal of jade, the jade is all there in the lowest plateau, in tombs, in burials of ritual kinds, and so on. So jade turns up, and metal doesn't. So the whole way of collecting metal is quite different. I do think that the writing about individual tombs, which was pressed on me by the publisher, not my choice, has been extremely helpful. And I do think looking at assemblages is essential. For Professor Shi, she has the whole of the court. She has the court of the Qianlong and Yongzheng and Kangxi emperors, and you can assemble, to some extent, what they owned at one point, what they did with those things in their rituals and in their daily life. And I think that is very informative. But so to answer Professor Lee and Professor Shi is to say, I looked at things from the British Museum outwards and realized I was looking at something that was different. And I think reading things in context helps. It doesn't mean that art objects are not wonderful, that you can have great individual objects. I think the buffalo is wonderful, though there are other more wonderful bronzes. But you want to see where the buffalo fits. He doesn't have 9 buffaloes, but he has 9 deer. So that tells you something. And I think it's that kind of comparison within a set, between sets, that helps get the language. It also helps, I think, to look at things cross-culturally. And to me, the interaction with the steppe has been very significant And if I was working now again in the later period, I would spend more time looking at Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kazakhstan. I do think they're very important to China's middle period. The later period, then again, we are looking at the West and China in interaction. So I do think you can apply this language to all periods, but as it happens, the existence of the tombs and their very great richness makes that easier. So I think I'll stop there. I hope I've thought about some of the things. I don't think I completely got the points that were being made by Professor Chen. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Rawson. I now would like to move on to the third part of today's program. That is, we are inviting our audience here to raise questions. They have indeed done so through Slido. So far, we have already collected a couple of questions, and I'll read these questions to Professor Rawson by order, and hopefully you can actually pick and choose to answer these questions, because some of the questions are actually kind of a sort of reiteration of those raised by our panelists. I also understand that we are running slightly short of time. I was just given an instruction from the foundation that we may extend our discussion time a little bit more to say 15 minutes after 6 o'clock here Taipei time. I hope that is all right with Professor Rawson, because we do want to seize this opportunity to have more dialogue with you. So the first question raised by one of the audience, Anonymous, the question is it possible to translate the visual language of Chinese objects into a Western context, namely in museums where we are only looking at snippets of history? I think this is more or less the question that we sort of anticipate. So, given your experience as a keeper of antiques, Oriental antiques in British museums, how would you like to guide your audience or your visitors through the visual language to understand Chinese civilization?
Well, I think that is now a problem that I face. I don't think I could do it in the British Museum. If you go to Baoji and to the museum representing the Western Zhou, they do in fact reconstruct a tomb. I'm not sure. I think you have to do this reconstruction in your head. I think you have to say to yourself, when I'm listening, as I do all the time, when I'm listening to someone speaking Chinese, I'm listening and saying, now what does that mean? So I'm interrogating myself about a language that I only half know. So when you're the man introducing us today was speaking in Chinese, I was interpreting that to me. And I think actually that's what you have to do. I think when you read a book, you are sort of stringing words together, and then you're saying, how do you understand it? You can't, the fact of knowing English as a 10-year-old doesn't help you read Chaucer or Dickens or Shui Zhuang. You're going to have to learn how that language and the text fits into society, in fact. So I suspect what I think one needs to do is to say to people or write books. I think there's more to be written about this. When you go to a museum, it's like opening a book and having no time to read the poem properly. You look at a single object or a group of objects, but actually to get a sense of the feel of them, you're going to have to learn more, see more. In my early days, writing the Sackler catalogues and spending time in America, I learned a lot more about technology and how the bronzes were made, though I now think my ideas need to change. People have done more work, but the same is true of ceramics. But I think you have to get beyond the technology of the object, beyond its visual appearance. You need to learn about what I call this choreography, how they're moved around in life. And I don't think it's very different with language and books. If you want to understand a text like Chaucer, that's a difficult, I mean, I can only understand it if it's read aloud. I don't understand it by reading the page. I can understand the sound, and then I have to try and understand the society to which it belonged. Mm-hmm. So I don't think it's very different. When we cook in our kitchens, we don't need to have anything explained. When we look at the Shang dynasty, we do need a bit of explanation.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you very much. The second question from Brian Lee, the question goes like this. The bronze vessels have quite different roles and meanings in China and the steppe. I would like to ask about the role of a bronze in the context of the steppe society, as opposed to the society of China, of course. Yeah.
Well, there are two kinds of vessel in the steppe. Mostly, there are a few kinds of vessel made for cooking. So those are daily life vessels. They're not, I think, ritual vessels mostly, though they may have a ceremonial purpose. There are also a few Chinese vessels in Inner Mongolia or around Beijing, and I think those vessels have been looted or acquired by steppe-type people from more central areas. And actually, I think those are status symbols on one hand, and a rather perhaps naughtily a source of metal, because they can be melted down and made into weapons. And we have plenty of evidence that the steppe people on the borders of China melted down these vessels and made them into weapons, because they used a Chinese alloy, which actually isn't very good for weapons, and we can see it by analyzing. So I think rather surprisingly, but it's partly geographical, there's a strong boundary between those who use vessels for ritual, for offerings to the ancestors, and those who use vessels for either shamanistic rituals that contact the natural world, or actually melt them down to make weapons. I think there is quite a strong borderline which you can find at different periods.
All right, thank you very much. The third one from one of the audience, anonymous. The question is it possible to further understand the nature of this upheaval that is evident from the change in ritual vessels? Because you were talking about upheaval in your presentation. This member of the audience is curious about a little more explanation of this upheaval that is evident from the change in the vessels. For example, by using textual sources, can we rely upon textual sources to further our understanding of the meaning of the upheaval employed in the vessels?
Well, I'm very interested in that, and I've provoked a lot of controversy from the textual people. I would say two things. If you like, history has helped us a bit. The historical evidence shows us that there was both a problem in the court that an uncle succeeded a nephew. There was something has gone wrong in the succession, and an important Western scholar called Yuri Pines has written about that. And the second, if you like, textual information is inscriptions in bronze vessels. We know firmly that what are called the Rung, that is, people in the lowest plateau, were invading and constantly disturbing the situation, so that the Zhou elite left the Wei River Basin. Now that is quite an upheaval. So it looks as though the change in vessel type took place in the 9th century, perhaps the late 9th century, due to upheavals that were both political, internal, but perhaps more important, physical pressure, which forced the Zhou to move to the more prosperous lands anyway. The eastern part in the North China Plain is much more prosperous. So they moved perhaps because it was more prosperous, but they certainly left the Wei Valley. So we do know that. Now, there's another kind of evidence which Martin Kern at Harvard has put forward, and he dates the Book of Songs ritual hymns, if you like, which we learn about how some of the aspects of the ceremony took place. He dates those to the late Western Zhou or early Eastern Zhou, and similarly for the texts in the Shujing. Now, what it implies is that there was textual rewriting or commemoration of Zhou achievements at a time when there was difficulty in the court. And so in my chapter in this book, I have actually put this all together. I would put both the images of the vessels, the fact that they knew the older vessels that they left behind, the fact that they were actually buried with a lot of jades, and this writing down of the history of the early Zhou. I would put them all together as signs of, if you like, a very clever. I think the Zhou are immensely clever. I admire them hugely. They're so skillful as politicians. I think they were reorganizing everything to give themselves status and security at a time which is difficult.
Thank you very much. The next question is from Lawrence. The question is, I would like to ask if there are research topics in the current Sinology field that you think you would be interested in looking into, but have yet to be researched. As if you weren't busy enough.
I'm pretty busy, actually. I mean, what I would like to know more about are I think there are two things that are really important that are not written about enough. One is the Loess Plateau in early China, how there's some wonderful people who write about bronze casting molds, and there's one particular scholar in Toronto, I think, or Canada, who's done some marvelous work on the, if you like, the microscopic arrangement of the crystals in the molds. I would like to know more about how these molds are made and how the physical geological environment affected that, and whether that really affected how the bronzes were made. Because I think it's not just a ritual question, it's also a technological question. And then I have another question, which is how China's weight, if you like, shifts south. That the big basins of the Yangtze River are enormously prosperous and very, very important, but in the Bronze Age are separate. They are very different. The Chongqing area, the Chengdu area is different from the Hubei area, which is different from the delta at Yangzhou, so the tremendous difference. But then as the Han collapse and the outsiders move in, forming slightly stronger governments than they did earlier, or forming any sort of government, people and scholars and elite move south. And gradually, the importance of China moves south. And I think that is something that's really interesting. It's interesting in what one might call the early medieval period. And I would be very interested in looking at what is dominated by archaeology along the northern rivers and the Loess Plateau, how the archaeology of the south, something I have not studied, shows up the growing importance of southern China. And I think southern China is very important at all periods, but we move from a very distinctly separated set of basins to a much more related group of people in the late Tang, and then in the late Sung period, and then in the Yuan and Ming, we're getting huge efforts in the south. So I would say I had these two interests, but I'm already full of activity. I don't know that I'll ever manage either of these.
Okay, so we'll make sure that you will move on with a lot of more new projects and the topics to engage you. All right. The next question is from one of the audience named Cho Ling Ling. I think this is a lady. She asked, I wonder about the relationship between your book titled The Chinese Ornament and Alois Riegel, excuse me for my pronunciation, book titled The Problems of Style, Foundations for a History of Ornament.
Well, I was very much influenced by that book, and therefore in communication, in leading to changes in ornament. That's what he wrote. He wrote about carpets, and particularly about Western Asian carpets and their impact in the West. You could say perhaps one of the not quite failures, but biases of my Lotus and the Dragon is that I spend an awful lot of time on motifs and detail. Nowadays, if I wrote it again, I would make it much more about the political movement and the importance of Buddhism, how Buddhism develops, again, this north-south difference, how does it play out, the difference between the Buddhist domination, particularly in the north, and then the force of the economy in the south. Riegel wasn't into that at all, but I think nowadays, I was very influenced by Riegel and by Gombrich and people like that, and by my life in the British Museum. But I would now turn to a different way of looking at China and look much more at the geographical and economic difference that is very striking. I mean, if you travel in China, the most important thing you see is this huge regional difference, huge also intellectual and religious differences, and above all, economic. And I think that has a much bigger effect than I've ever allowed it to impinge on me, but I ought to have allowed it more.
Thank you very much. The next question is raised, seems to me is raised by a group of promoters of a program named 碰触历史 or Touching History. They actually raised a very, very interesting question. They wanted to find out, Professor Rawson, whenever you had your first opportunity to look at the objects under study, what kind of a feeling you might have? How do you feel you are enlightened by this kind of immediate sensorial experience of touching the objects in study?
Well, that I think is important, very important. I learned it first, not in Britain at all, and not in China. I went as an 18-year-old on an expedition, an excavation in the Middle East, in what was in those days Israel, not Israel, it was Jordan, in the city of Jerusalem. And I joined an excavation for 3 years in the 60s before the reconquest by Israel. I joined this Jordan excavation in the city of Jerusalem. And there were about 10 different sites. I was in a little site on a big slope, on a very early site. But there was another very big site where they excavated a medieval area which had Chinese ceramics. So it was very hands-on activity. If you've ever excavated, it was a very big excavation. It was run by a woman called Dr. Kathleen Kenyon, and it was my entry into objects because we would get up at 4 o'clock, we would start digging at 5 o'clock, we would have breakfast at 9 o'clock, and we would finish at 1 o'clock with lunch, and then we would go home and rest, and then at 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock in the evening, we would come back to the site and handle the ceramics and learn what we had excavated in different parts of the site. And there is where I learned the touch business. And I'm not very good, I'm rather muddled often in what I write. I'm dyslexic in what they say in English. Chinese characters, fortunately, are not affected by this, my problem with English spelling. So I find Chinese characters more illuminating than English spelling. But I don't have any trouble with identifying objects. And I found then, and I was only 18, that I was one of the quickest at learning this pottery stuff. I could identify them almost immediately. And then on a very rare occasions, only 2 or 3 times in the 3 months of each excavation, we went to the Armenian Garden, as it was called, which was the site with the Chinese ceramics. And there was ceramics from the 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th century laid out in rows. You know, we would dig up masses of ceramics every day. So that's where I learned about Chinese trade, about the very different texture of Chinese ceramics from these early Bronze Age and Iron Age Palestine ceramics. It was an amazingly eye-opening experience. And I think from that moment on, I've been fearless about handling or identifying objects. It was, if you like, it's like discovering, I have a grandson who's very good at music. It's like discovering that you have a good ear. I discovered that ceramics and identifying physically with my hands objects was something that I would enjoy and made me feel better when I kept on making spelling mistakes.
That's great. Okay, we actually have got quite a number of questions, but in the interest of time, 2 more questions to go. The first one by Xu Ya Wei, I believe. This is a lady. The question is, in view in view of the spread of animal style in contemporaneous East Europe, how do you view this broad development and the role of a Western Zhou, I suppose Western Zhou animal motif or animal style in it? This is a comparative question.
Yeah, that's a big puzzle and one I'm very interested in. Firstly, I would say that if you use not language but the word inventory, you find that the whole of the steppe from the 9th century down to today almost, but also down to the 2nd century, from the 9th century BC to 2nd century BC, uses a similar inventory. And the inventory consists of three things: weapons, which are daggers and knives, horse equipment of various types, and animal objects that are pinned on their clothes or on their weaponry. And it's the animal motifs are restricted to what they're used on. They're not making vessels covered in animals. They put them on their clothes or on their weapons. I believe that this animal motif thing, which is really only seen in a large scale in the steppe, actually comes from Western Asia and seeps into the steppe over many centuries, even millennia. So a site called Maikop is one of the routes into the steppe north of in the Volga Caspian Sea region. So there is a movement out of Western Asia, but it's not very direct, it's not very frequent. But you see these animal motifs also on what are called deer stones. So animal motifs are part of the petroglyphs and the objects used in the steppe. What I suspect about the animal motifs in China, which turn up first most vividly in jade carving, Western Zhou jade carving, is that there is some sort of contact. And I'm particularly interested in the Baoji tombs at Ruzhuazhuang, where there are animal motifs. In that period, I would be prepared to say there are certainly some steppe introduction there. But I'm much more uncertain about the Shang. There are a few animal motifs very visible in Shang jade and on Shang bronzes, but I'm not going to say at this minute that I could demonstrate they came from the steppe. It's possible that they did. I would say China, in the period down to the spring and autumn period, has a very mixed population. It's not terribly worried about who is a Han Chinese or not. I mean, they don't have that concept. It's only in the Chunqiu or Zhangguo period that they start to have this inside-outside thing. So, but I don't want, if I did research and I was able to go to Taiwan and to China, I might look at the Shang animals, but I don't know that I could decide, and I'm not sure. I mean, there are things that I think must have a steppe background, but I don't want to say that they have. I think they might have, and there's plenty of early stuff coming into the steppe, but until you've walked over the ground and found some more physical evidence, it would be difficult. So I don't know the answer.
All right, thank you very much. Last but not least, this is a question from a MA student of National Taiwan University Institute of Art History, 台湾大学艺术史研究所的硕士生谢承恩. All right, the question is actually a very general question. Professor Rawson, how would you assess or evaluate the contemporary field of art history studies in general? How everything's going on in the field contemporarily, particularly in the context when Asia is being used as a kind of a model or kind of framework through which to understand art history studies in general. A second question, equally a very general question. Could you have some advice for all of us as to how we can take advantage of the method of comparison or contrast, comparative methodology, how we could better make use of this comparative method for our study?
Well, I think most art historians would say I was very old-fashioned and very positivist and not theoretical enough. So I don't think I'm a good example to follow in any way. I think what you see in me is someone who has had a lot of material experience. And if you want to study anything, I cannot emphasize more the need to have material experience, to physically either look at paintings or hold objects, and also, in the case of modern art, read what people have written about their own paintings. But I think over-theorizing doesn't help when you're looking back to the periods I look at. And I still think the physical and the material is what matters, because that is what the artist or the ceramicist used himself or herself. So while I know that this huge emphasis on theory is taking place, I do debate it with my colleagues here at Oxford, I do think, for me, and what I've done, the actual physical material matters most. But I think you have to go beyond the material and say, what am I looking at? What is the society saying? What is the craftsman saying, the patron, and the society? I don't think you can just say it's beautiful or I like it. I think you need to look at the evidence of where it stood in that society. And that helps a lot if you read what the people of the time, you may not have a text, but you will have a tomb or a room or a campsite if you're looking at the steppe and so on. I think comparatively, I would emphasize that when I'm talking to my Western friends who wonder why I study China, I say, well, you have only got China to compare. It is the culture that balances Western Asia. And Western Asia and Egypt and Greece and Rome are the heritage of Western Europe, and therefore the heritage also of Australia, America, etc. So China, Korea, and Japan are on the other side. And I think it's extremely helpful to put ourselves in the West in proportion and see that there is this other way of doing things, other ways of thinking, other ways of dressing, other ways of honoring the spirits and the dead. I think that it's very important to see oneself in this mirror, if you like, and see that it's different. Now, the same is true of China, and I feel the whole of China needs to balance itself and say, well, we don't know that we actually like what's on the other side, but they're there, and we need to see that there are different ways to live and different ways to exist. And that's what I've learned from this comparative. As it happens, China is next door to the steppe, and it's a long way from Europe. But now with the Belt and Road and with sea, there's plenty of interaction with Europe. And I think both sides gain by respecting the other choices, because we've each made choices. Each side has a portfolio of possibilities. China did not have the possibilities of building the stone sculpture of Egypt. Egypt did not have the possibility of making the great ceramics of China. So we need to see the difference due to historical, but also geological and geographical situations, and realize that humans are unusual in having the ability to make different choices. There are other choices to study, of course, in Central America, Australia, but for those of us in Eurasia, there are these two big cultures, which are also in America. So I just say that it's useful to study the other side. Whether you like it or not is a different question, but studying is always worthwhile, and I've had a fantastic life in seeing that there was this choice.
Thank you very much, Professor Rawson. I think that's the perfect answer to bring our dialogue to an end. Professor Rawson and the ladies and gentlemen, I think we are already 15 minutes over time, and we need to bring our forum to an end. I think at this point, we are all impressed by Professor Rawson's erudition, her insightful comments on those questions and suggestions, her humbleness, and particularly her good sense of humor. This was really purely a pleasure for me to be part of this dialogue, and as a student of the conversation, I feel I should have taken art history as my first major. This is truly the most powerful communication between Taiwan and the UK. I really appreciate this opportunity to help moderate this forum, and definitely I think all of us are sharing one big wish, that is Professor Rawson will be able to make her trip to Taipei next year, hopefully, and so that we could meet each other face to face, but not necessarily in touch, of course, but still we definitely enjoy our conversation very much, and certainly we look forward to learning from you, your wisdom, your discovery, and of course we have our best wishes for the publication of your new book, which is coming out 2023. I would like to use this opportunity to thank the Tang Foundation for sponsoring the whole event, and of course our three panelists who also share their insights with all of us for this wonderful afternoon. And now I think at this point, I would like to invite everybody to join me in thanking Professor Rawson for her contribution to the field and for her wonderful contribution to this particular forum. Thank you very much, Professor Rawson, for a wonderful afternoon for us. And I hope you will take a good break after this long and intensive conversation. Thank you very much, and good evening, everybody here in Taipei. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.